Aí você tem que colocar o seu e-mail.
Tá bem posicionada a câmera? Parece que tá bom.
Virar pra ele, né?
Dá pra dar um ask pra mim, tá?
Isso aí. Excuse me.
Já tá no barulho, mas
Melhor, né? Ok.
Julia.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, thank you for setting this up, and thank you to Unicamp for inviting me to speak in this third lecture on the subject of psychosocial perspectives and climate psychology perspectives on the climate emergency. One of the aspects of trying to understand a different way of perceiving the climate emergency is to try and understand everything as being interconnected and the body of the individual being only part of different kinds of bodies that constitute the world or constitute the universe. And what this lecture is going to try to discuss is the idea that we need to move away from the individualized idea of the body, and we need to move towards an understanding of the Earth and of human systems as bodies within bodies. One of the principal difficulties of trying to understand where we stand with climate change is in the issue and the problem of our bodies being separate from the body of the Earth. So this is an important way of changing that perspective. In order to understand this graphically, this image of a deconstructed car really does express the idea of the value of the holistic body as opposed to body parts. So in this image, there's a metaphorical illustration of the value of holistic perceptions. So the body of the car exists when each part of the car, each element of the car, the wheels, the steering wheel, the lights, the roof, the windows, the engine, each part of the car comes together in a single body, and then we can say that this is a car. However, if we separate the elements of the body of the car into its fragments, it's difficult for us to imagine what the car is. And it's similar in climate change. If we look at a single element of climate change, if we look at a part that of the whole scenario of climate change, if we look, for example, at problems of flooding, or if we look at problems of the consumption of meat, what we're doing is we're looking at a small fragment of the whole body of climate change. And when we do that, we're unable to perceive the entire problem. Just like if we look at the fragment of a car, like a wheel, it's very difficult to imagine the whole car. So this speaks to the idea in complexity theory that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And this goes really against some of the way that we do see the world. If you like, the scientific paradigm tends to fragment big issues into small issues in order to experiment on fragments, in order to understand the meaning of a fragment, because the whole is too difficult to perceive. And as we saw before, the idea of a whole that is too difficult to perceive can be compared to Timothy Morton's idea of a hyper-object. So Timothy Morton compares the hyper-object with the global warming situation, climate change, the climate emergency, saying that the climate emergency cannot be perceived as a whole. And so this is an issue, this is a problem. If you can't perceive it, then how do you tackle it? And the scientific answer to that is you perceive it by fragmenting it into little parts that you can perceive. But by doing that, you take away the actual quality and nature of the climate emergency. So I think it's important and it's relevant to ask ourselves exactly what is a body. According to the French philosopher Gilles Deleuze, he talked about the strange concept of a body without organs. And although it's a complicated concept, at a basic level, it can be understood as a body constituted by all existing elements, including the non-human and including the inorganic, defined by their relationship with each other rather than things in themselves. And in this way, by talking about the body without organs, you remove the taken for grantedness of the body with organs. And the body with organs, of course, the example of that, the maximum example of that is the human being, the individual. And what Deleuze is saying is we need to understand the entire body of things in their whole element, their whole way of being. And the problem with situating an understanding of these things in the individual, the human body, the body with organs, is that we fail to give the importance that's necessary to the way everything is constituted as a whole body. So the whole world, the whole issue of climate change should be viewed as a body. And from this perspective, the inorganic things are given a life. They become an inorganic life of things, according to Deleuze. And in this way, all those different elements, the non-human, the inorganic, the organic, the body with organs, the human beings, all of these are given an equal status. You might even call it a democratic status, because they're defined, as we've just seen, not in themselves, but they're defined through the relationships that each element has with the other. You might compare this is maybe an idea, you might compare this with the idea of James Lovelock's Gaia theory. James Lovelock and Margulis introduced this idea of the Gaia theory. The Gaia theory is not connected with Deleuze's idea of the body without organs, but what we can do is we can say, well, maybe we can see how the Gaia theory can usefully be compared with the idea of the body without organs and the idea that things are related to each other and that you could have a whole, which is like the Gaia theory, the whole Earth becomes a living entity in itself. So there are many ways of understanding body and bodies, and how, because we are part of particular bodies, our own body becomes part of another body, and the other body becomes part of yet another body. And it's quite useful to view this in terms of the way things are nested into each other, the way the micro might be, for example, each individual, the way the micro is combined with the meso, and the way the meso is combined with the macro. So that instead of existing only as a micro, only as an individual, we exist as individuals within different nesting possibilities. So I exist within possibility of another body, which might be the meso, and the meso is influenced by the macro. So as individuals, many of us are members of bodies, so to speak, of an institutional body that itself can provide many reasons, all in the form of defences for not taking action. So the institutional body, the work organisation that we work with, for example, can work in conjunction with individuals to influence the way individuals behave. So the body of the organisation supports defences against realities in different ways and according to different defence needs. In many cases, the individual body and the institutional body work together to prevent or cancel out difficult thoughts. As part of this process, all the focus is towards an internal task. So in this process, the internal task of the institution is what people will be focusing on in their place of work. And all that is external to this, including climate change, is ignored. The institutional relationship with the individual provides mutually agreed defences against a range of emotions. So if, as an individual, I might feel anxiety or guilt, or if I might feel shame or fear of failure, the institution will help me to defend myself against these important emotions by enabling me to focus on the institution rather than what is external to the institution. The thing that causes my fears, my guilt, such as climate change, that will be regarded by the body of the institution as not being relevant to the work.
Julian, can you give us a little break because the image of the slide
It's
is
just a
not...
second.
Just a second.
There's a problem with the presentation. The slides are not online, so I have to put it. It's just a second. Ah, quando a gente apertou ocultar, deixa eu ver. Gente, quem tá aí no chat consegue dizer se tá aparecendo?
Eu tô vendo você.
Tá, ok. Então vamos tentar de novo.
Oi, você tem que compartilhar slide. Você vai entrar, apresentar.
Então, eu coloquei aqui.
Slide, aí seu computador. Aí você vai no arquivo e baixa ele. Você está compartilhando a tela.
Entendi, eu tava compartilhando a janela que tava apresentando.
É apresentar, slide, seu computador, daí você baixa o arquivo.
Ah, entendi o que o Diego quis dizer também.
Entendeu?
Só um segundo, deixa eu ver se funciona.
Apresentar. Acho que agora foi. Peraí. Deixa eu ver. Agora foi. Que slide que ele tá aí?
Tá no Containing Anxiety in Institutions.
Que número?
Ah, tá, desculpa. No 6.
6. Isso, agora ele consegue compartilhar, tá bom?
Mudando aí?
Aqui não.
Não? Tá mudando aí? Aí não tá?
Aqui não. Aqui tá parado. Tá parado.
Vai ter que mudar por aqui junto.
Mas não tô vendo.
Agora deu certo.
Não, essa é a questão.
Agora ele tá mudando.
Sim, só que aí, aqui a gente só vai ver a tela assim, então, porque se a gente colocar a tela inteira aqui, não vai mexer aqui dentro, entendeu? Aqui a gente mexe dentro do que está sendo transmitido. E aí, com a tela inteira assim, tipo,
Não,
a gente só. Gente,
não sei o que ela fez.
we're waiting. I'm sorry, I never.
We're waiting now.
Yes.
Shall I start again?
No, I don't think so, no. We continue.
As you like, I am at your service.
Que bom.
O José Maria foi ver. Segundo. Deixa eu botar aqui.
Eu não consigo entrar no...
Oi?
Zé Maria?
No palco, Valéria.
Oi.
Peraí, deixa eu te ajudar aí. Como é que tá?
Oi, eu não consigo... Se eu sair e voltar.
Quer que eu entre aqui para tentar?
Entre você, eu vou sair e vou voltar.
Tá, pera, eu vou tentar entrar. Peraí. Tudo bem?
Tudo bem?
Me apresento. Eu sou o Diretor, eu estou no organização do evento lá.
Então, o problema é que vocês não compartilharam os slides.
O professor, ele não
Pode-
deu
pode
para... O que eu pedi para a Lavínia foi, ela falou que tela cheia, ela compartilha a tela dela e a gente testou e deu certo, só que ela não fez isso, ela tirou.
Não, eu acabei de fazer, você não estava errado, Diego. Foi isso aqui que eu fiz, ó. Apresentar, compartilhar a tela, janela. Aqui, ó.
Ó, esse verde.
E aí eu dei o tab para sair.
Então, Lavínia, mas compartilha a tela. Aí, ó, coloca essa em tela cheia agora, por favor. Desculpa, a gente está na sala, estou na linha, eu saí correndo aqui na secretaria para ver. Então, você deixou em tela cheia na sala, certo?
Uhum.
Só que para a gente está compartilhada a tela do PowerPoint sem tela cheia. Então, eu vou pedir o seguinte, tira isso daí, tira esse compartilhamento de tela. Pronto. Agora volta lá. Pode esse aqui também, não precisa não. Volta lá no PowerPoint.
Uhum.
Coloca em tela cheia.
Ok.
Agora você vai sair daí com Alt Tab, não sai com ESC, por favor.
Pode voltar.
Voltou no navegador, certo?
Sim.
Coloca
Assim?
aí para baixar a tela cheia. Veio para cá. Tenta alterar para ver se ele muda normal.
Você vê por aqui, que eu acho que vai ser melhor, porque eu vi que tava no 3G, e aí vai dar que a gente pode fazer.
Vê se ele muda daí, se muda de cá.
Mudei.
Igual que ele estava fazendo. Perfeito.
Ok.
Então. Pareceu, muda mais um, porque mudou no seu agora. Então tá certo. Desculpa, gente.
Tudo bem? Precisa de mais alguma coisa?
Tá tudo certo, Diego. Obrigada.
Por nada. Boa conferência para vocês. Gente, eu estou acompanhando no chat se precisar, só não consigo ouvir, tá?
Então, mas não, é porque, tipo assim, o que eu vi é porque eu achei que tava compartilhando o meu Wi-Fi, mas eu compartilhando o meu 3G. E aí, como é a transmissão, vai acabar em algum momento.
Não tem problema, então. Então, eu desligo o meu e você acompanha.
Ah, ok.
Podemos retomar, então, Zé Maria? Julian, it's okay. You can continue from the 50.
Você não acha que começa?
Vai.
Acho que não foi nem 5 minutos.
Acho que não.
Eu acho que não. Tipo, podia começar, porque o pessoal tinha reclamado dos slides, talvez fosse difícil de acompanhar.
Lavinia thinks it's better to start again.
From the beginning.
Right.
Thank you.
Okay.
Grazie.
Are we ready?
Thank you. Yes.
Yes?
Yes, correct.
Linear, shall I ocultar?
Yes.
Saiu do seu.
Aqui tá usando certinho.
Eu não estou usando muito o seu, certo?
Sim.
Então,
É que eu não consegui conectar na internet daqui.
não tem problema. Uma coisa que eu sou acompanhando.
Okay, shall I start? Yes?
Please.
So I'm going to talk today in this third lecture on psychosocial perspectives on the climate emergency related to climate psychology. And in doing so, I'm going to talk about the idea of different bodies. The reason for talking about different bodies is that we always assume the body to be the human body, and this assumption leads us to a very human-centered view of the universe, and there is a way of understanding the world which is not just through the individual, not just through the human body, but understanding the effects of the climate emergency as being something that is relevant to the whole body of existing things, including the non-organic, including the non-human, and including animals, plants, and human beings, all in relationship to each other. So in order to understand how we might be better placed to deal with the climate emergency, maybe it's a good idea to question whether the human body, the individual of the human body, is a good place to start or not. And this is connected with the idea that we might view things more holistically instead of viewing things in a fragmented state. So the image here on the screen is, if you like, a metaphorical image to represent the validity of seeing things as a whole. The car, for example, in the image, when it's deconstructed into fragments, such as the wheel, steering wheel, the window, the lights, the roof, the door, the engine, etc. When you fragment the car into its constituent, the elements that make up the car, it's very difficult to imagine what the car might look like as a whole. So if you just take the wheel, take one wheel, and analyze one wheel, it's very difficult to imagine the entire body of the car. So although you might be able to get some information about the wheel, for example, the material that it's made of, it would be very difficult for you to understand the relationship between the wheel and the body of the car. So this is an example of how fragmentation can make it difficult for us to understand the whole. Similarly, in the situation of the climate emergency, the whole emergency as one huge problem with many constituent parts is something that is very difficult to comprehend, and I think it's one of the difficulties of understanding the climate emergency. It's very similar to what Timothy Morton calls a hyper-object. So Timothy Morton compares the climate emergency to a hyper-object. That is an object which is so huge and so vast that we find it very difficult, if not impossible, to perceive what it is. And so it is with the climate emergency. However, if you break up the climate emergency into its constituent parts, if you analyze, for example, the warming of the water in the oceans, or if you analyze flooding, or if you analyze other fragmented aspects of the climate emergency, although you get information about that little fragment, it's very difficult to put all the fragments together and understand the whole. So we have a tension when we're considering the climate emergency. We have a tension between trying to understand the whole body of the climate emergency and trying to understand the body through the fragmented parts of that body. And it's a serious problem. In reality, the issue of the problem of climate change speaks to the idea in complexity theory that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. So it's worth, therefore, asking ourselves the strange question, what is a body? It's a strange question because we might take it for granted that the body is the individual. I am a body, I have a body, I am a human being, and that's what a body is. But the idea that the thoughts and feelings come from me or from you or from an individual as different bodies is problematic when trying to consider the vast elements that constitute the body of climate change. So it's worth considering different aspects of body. So, for example, the philosopher Gilles Deleuze talked about the body without organs, which is almost a contradiction for us if we consider the body to be the human body. And although it's a complicated concept, at a basic level, this can be understood as a body constituted by all existing elements, including the non-human and including the inorganic, and that these different elements are not defined in themselves, in their fragments. They're defined by the relationships they have with each other. And in this way, we remove the taken for grantedness of the body with organs, that is to say, ourselves, the human being. In support of this idea, Deleuze was able to consider the apparently contradictory inorganic life of things. On the boundaries of science, this might helpfully be compared with Gaia theory. James Lovelock and Lynn Margulis created the Gaia theory, which understands the Earth as being an entire living entity, including the stones, the rocks, the water, the mountains, the volcanoes, the lakes, the atmosphere, the winds, and so on. Everything that constitutes the world is viewed as a living body. It's viewed as a living body because although it includes inorganic things, those inorganic things are linked in relationship to other things, so that the inorganic and the organic, the non-human and the human are all interlinked through relationships, and they can be defined as linked through relationships as opposed to defined as small fragments. So another body that we might consider is the institutional body. So when we think about bodies, we might think about this simple diagram which depicts the micro, the meso, and the macro, and the micro is somewhere where each of us might be located. The meso is what we're nested within, for example, an institution, and the macro is, for example, what happens in the global political world in a very large, on a very large scale. And although I am not the macro, I am obviously nested into the macro, and I'm nested into the meso, and it's very difficult to establish a boundary between micro, meso, and macro. So my body is not something which is completely boundaried. It's not it's not a skin bag. It's something which has a permeable boundary and which is permanently interconnected with the other aspects of the universe that I inhabit. So as individuals, many of us are members, or many of us are bodies of an institutional body that itself can provide many reasons, all in the form of defenses for not taking action, because the body of the organization supports defenses against realities in different ways and according to different defense needs. So the place where I work, the organization where I work, or the organization where I practice my faith, if I'm religious, any organization that I'm in contact with will join with me to defend myself and to defend the entity, the organization, against things which interfere with my mission in life or the entity's mission in life. So it's very easy for the place that I work in, the entity, the body that I work for and I work in, it's very easy for that body to eliminate external issues from the daily life that I have within the body of the institution. So the problem of the climate emergency is not something which the institution will allow to become part of the problems that we deal with in everyday life. In many cases, the individual body and the institutional body, therefore, work together to prevent or cancel out difficult thoughts. As part of this process, all the focus of the institution is towards an internal task, the task of the work, the task of the organization, the task of the faith group, the task of where we study, the task of where we work. That task takes away any exterior feeling that might interfere with the task. And this, of course, includes climate change. So the institutional relationship with the individual can provide a mutually agreed defense against a range of emotions that I might feel. So if I think about the climate emergency, I might become anxious, I might feel guilty, I might feel other emotions such as shame or fear, particularly fear of failure. I might feel all of these negative emotions, and in particular, I might become anxious about these negative emotions, and these anxieties, the institutions I'm in will not want to permit such anxieties to interfere with the task, interfere with the work. And so the institution will set up suitable defenses, not permitting the individual body to be interrupted by emotional thoughts which are not relevant to the task of the institution. A lot of the ideas related to institutional defenses have emerged from the writing of Isabel Menzies Lythe, who talked about institutional defenses against anxiety. Now, in Menzies Lythe's seminal work on the institutional defenses in a hospital, with the hospital attempting to defend the nurses against the anxiety of their work, Menzies Lythe discovered several defined ways that the institution would defend the nurses against the anxiety of their work. But although this study is about hospitals and nurses, a lot of the institutional defences that were defined in this work are transferable to other situations. So this study was about how hospitals try to defend nurses against the anxiety of work. And the more anxiety is generated in individuals, the more individual and institutional defences work to prevent the roots of this anxiety from emerging and disturbing the individual bodies and their work. Now, in the case of climate change, if we transfer these feelings and ideas to the case of climate change, this will easily be discarded as irrelevant to the immediate needs of the individual and the institution. So what touches us most as individual human beings, the emotions that we feel, will be kept away from us, away from the task of the institution through a whole variety of defences. And here are some of the defences that Menzies Live identified that the hospital was attempting to support the nurses by defending them in these ways. So to the left of the screen, you have Menzies Live's list, or my list of her identified defences, institutional defences, and to the right, you can see how these might be translated into ideas about climate change. So one of the institutional defences that were provided for nurses in the hospital was depersonalization. So nurses were taught not to identify patients in their beds with their names, not to establish a relationship with patients as people, but rather to depersonalize, to take away the personal relationship between nurse and patient and identify the patient by the illness that they had and by the number on their bed. So they would be asked, for example, to if someone had problems with heart disease, they would be referred to as the heart in bed 306. Okay, so that's the way they would depersonalize the relationship between the nurse and the patient. A detachment and a denial of feelings. If the nurse was to start feeling sorry or sad or anxious about the situation of the patient, they would be encouraged to deny these feelings and to be clinical in their approach. Delegation of responsibility. If there are problems related to the health of someone, including serious problems in a hospital, these were not going to be responsibilities that any single person would take, particularly not a nurse. The nurse would refer the problem to someone else. Obscurity in lines of responsibility. If something goes wrong or if there's a difficulty, then it's not very clear who's responsible, so that nobody is blamed for any problem. Rituals replacing a task. Instead of understanding the task as related to, in the case of the hospital, as related to the health issue, it would become a ritual. So at 10 o'clock every day, the temperature of the patient would be taken and recorded at the end of the bed. At 4 o'clock every day, a cup of coffee or milk or water would be taken to the patient every day. And these things will become a ritual detached from the meaning of such things to the patient and to the nurse. There will be checking and counter-checking. Just in case there was a mistake, someone else would always check and someone else would always check. So you wouldn't have the anxiety of the responsibility of doing something wrong. So you would avoid risks. You turn your job into a routine, and you would avoid anything that might imply change. So all of these things, the institution, the hospital, would introduce all of these institutional defenses to protect the nurses against anxiety. It didn't work because the nurses were in the job to become human in their vocation. And what this did was it took away the vocational aspect of the work. It took away the human aspect of the work. So it wasn't a good way of defending nurses from anxiety. And, you know, if you try to translate these things into what you might think about climate change, so the idea of depersonalization, well, it's not my problem, okay? Denial of feelings, I don't feel the issues. I've got my own feelings, never mind about issues related to climate change. It's not my responsibility. It's not my problem because I'm not responsible for climate change. It's not my fault, so I'm not going to engage with it. I'm just too busy. I'm too busy with the work. You know, yes, it's a problem, but I'm too busy. My daily routine is so full, I really can't think outside it. And I don't like change. I'm reasonably happy as I am. So these kinds of thoughts, these kinds of ways of thinking can be supported by the institution where you work or another institution that you're engaged with. So if it's difficult to defend yourself against anxiety, either through yourself or through your institution, if it doesn't really work, then what does work? Well, one of the suggestions coming from psychosocial work is the idea of containment. Instead of providing defenses, you provide containment for difficult thoughts. So I'm going to talk a little bit about containment now. So defenses do exist for a reason. There's a good reason for defenses. And the reason is that if you don't have a defense, then of course you're open to the anxiety that you're defending yourself against. So there's a good reason for defenses. But although they support the individual and the institution in managing daily needs, they also hide and blind bodies to some difficult and important truths. So yes, defenses protect you to some extent from anxiety and negative feelings, but the price of that is to not face the issues and problems and the difficult truths. And you can easily see how this might work with climate, the climate emergency. You deny it or you pretend it's not there, so you take away your anxiety. But if you do that, you don't face up to it, and so no action is taken. You don't take action because you're blind to it, and you're blind to it because the blindness is a good defense against anxiety. You don't want anxiety. People don't want to feel negative things, and so they defend themselves. But by doing that, no action is taken because the fantasy is that it doesn't really exist. Okay? So defenses are better than nothing, but they're not so good as allowing feelings and thoughts to be reflected upon. So the question is, how can you reflect on negative, difficult, and anxious thoughts and feelings without being overwhelmed by anxiety? And then how can you use this knowledge in order to take action? So concerning the issue of climate change, the lack of reflective space of the problem leads to a lack of action. So this brings us to the idea of containment. So you can imagine, for example, in a group that's constituted for the common good and faced with a complex issues such as climate change, and this could be any group, including a group with different ideologies, there's a need for such a group in order to engage with such a debate, there's need for such a group for unconsciously held material to be brought into consciousness. So there is a need for this. These things that we deny, these things that we hold inside us as defenses, we need to bring them up into the debating scenario. We need to think about the things that are hidden from us. And secondly, for containment of difficult material, some skills need enhancing, what's sometimes called people skills. Skills such as respect, empathy, listening skills, tolerance, and at some stage, an ability and a mutually held desire to investigate and redefine the meaning of the contained emotion. So in order to receive what is hidden in the unconscious, you need all of these skills to enable these things to be expressed, to take them away, to lower the defenses and bring these things out. You need all of these skills. And these skills enable the expression of anxiety and associated negative feelings, and they then need to be contained until such a moment that they can be thought about. From the unconscious, hidden, to the conscious thinking scenario. So Wilfred Bion talked about the container and the contained in this way. And if you look at the graphic here, the uncontained person, someone who's not contained, might express feelings and thoughts and ideas in a disorganized and chaotic fashion, which are not very helpful as they stand. They're dramatic, they're bizarre, they're chaotic, they're projected, they're full of negativity and anxiety. So the uncontained person, if they express things like this, they can cause a lot of issues and a lot of problems. So instead of just leaving anxiety in the air, the idea is that someone or some way should be constructed so as to contain those things, to receive them and contain, so to introject what is projected, contain these things, and then in a given moment, when these things have been expressed, when safety has been established, safety from the danger of anxiety through containment, when these things have been contained and things are safe, in that safe moment, these things can be brought out of the container and translated into something you can think about, which is not bizarre, dangerous, and anxiety-provoking, because it has been contained and it has been brought out for thinking in a different place at a different time. So here's a nice image which represents the idea of container and contained. So you've got these horrible ideas, these horrible negative emotions, these anxiety-provoking issues related to climate change. For example, what am I going to do about my child's future? Am I giving my child the worst possible future by not tackling climate change? This is something I don't want to think about. So I'm going to keep it inside myself as a defense. However, given the right opportunity, maybe I can express that as long as it's contained here, as in the image. That's okay, I can do that. And then when the moment is right, we can take one of those elements out of the container and we can reflect upon it in another way. There are many different kinds of methods, many actions, many techniques, many tools for containment. However, containment is largely an attitude and an approach not really a method or a technique. And I think this is very important because we want to demystify the idea of containing. You don't have to have a special training in some special method, which is the containing method. You don't have to have that. What you have to do is understand what the containing attitude and the containing approach consists of. It's possible that such approaches can be supported by a variety of methods, but really it's about approaches. Some of these methods are used in academic research. Others have a philosophical way of understanding the world. Others could even be traditional or religious. And I'm just going to give a couple of very different examples that demonstrate that the method can be different, but what they have in common is the attitude and the containing approach. So the first example is a more or less philosophical example called Bohemian dialogue, which was created by David Bohm. And the other example is a sort of religious example, that of the Quaker meetings. There's a big difference in the way the method is conceived, the conception of the method, between David Bohm's method of dialogue compared to the Quaker meeting dialogue. But what we'll see is that they both provide the containing function. So first of all, if we look at Bohemian dialogue, here are some quotations from his book On Dialogue. In the dialogue group, we're not going to decide what to do about anything. So there's no pressure on someone to say something. The pressure is not an open containing situation. The pressure doesn't make people easy with expressing their negativity. So you take away the pressure by not having a destination. You leave it open. Okay. This is crucial, otherwise we're not free to express, free to take away the defense. We must have an empty space where we're not obliged to do anything, and so we can relax. We can feel that we're not judged. We can feel that we can say what we like. We're not going to come to any conclusions necessarily, okay? So we're not going to argue about things. We're not going to say anything necessarily, or we might say something, there's no obligation to speak. It's open and free. Therefore, freedom makes possible a creative perception of new orders of necessity. And the word creativity is absolutely crucial here. If we're talking about how do we deal with the climate emergency, it's a unique emergency. It's not like an emergency we've had before. So we need to be creative. And you can only be creative if you're free to express. And you can only freely express if there is a safe, containing space to express things. So if you can't do that, says David Bohm, you're not really free. Such freedom emerges from listening to everybody's opinions, to suspend them, not to judge them, not to blame them, not to argue about them, but just leave them suspended and to see what it all might mean. If we can see what all of our opinions mean, all of our opinions, not putting one opinion against another so that one opinion becomes superior to another, but if we can see what all of our opinions mean, then we are sharing a common content. So this is what Bohm calls participatory consciousness. And this kind of dialogue, this Bohemian dialogue, is also a containing dialogue because it's based on the idea of freedom to speak and participate and not being judged of your ideas and opinions, sharing ideas and opinions with everybody in a free and open space. That is a containing space because people are encouraged to express the things they wouldn't normally express. What about a Quaker meeting? Completely different. It's not a philosophical group. It's not a group of citizens without any particular agenda. A Quaker meeting is a religious meeting of people who call themselves friends, and they believe that people can have an access to God's voice directly without the mediation of a priest, for example. So they believe that people are capable of directly experiencing the divine nature of the universe, and that when someone needs to hear from God, they do, and the message should be shared. So there's nothing about God in Bohemian dialogue, but actually what happens is people are enabled to feel safe and free to speak and to not be judged. All of these things are similar to the Bohemian dialogue. The meeting begins with everyone gathering together in silence to quiet their minds. In the stillness, each person seeks a sense of connection and opens their hearts and lives to new insights, as in the creativity, new insights and guidance. Sometimes anyone may feel moved to offer a simple spoken message, a vocal ministry that is inspired by this holy encounter. So David Bohm's dialogue group is not a holy encounter, but the way that you are free to speak when you want, if you feel like it, that you're not judged, that everybody is encouraged to, in a common way, in a common dialogue, to share ideas, thoughts and feelings. That kind of feeling is similarly containing as David Bohm's work. So these are attitudes that can be applied to different situations. So attitudes of quality before method. Once again, just to remind us of these skills and attitudes that are necessary. Respect, empathy, listening skills, tolerance, all of these are necessary in the Quaker meeting, and all of these are necessary in Bohemian dialogue. Some stage, an ability and mutually held desire to investigate and redefine through creativity, redefine the meaning of the contained emotion, and trust maybe, and even maybe love, emotions that you wouldn't normally want to bring to an intellectual debate. These ways of working are ways of enabling the safe space of the container. So the difficult thoughts and anxiety of someone, this image on the right, can be projected into the person or the image on the left, going through ideas and feelings of trust and love. The reason it can be expressed is because the person expressing difficult thoughts and anxieties trusts and or loves the feeling that it can be expressed in a safe fashion. That is what the whole idea of container and contained is all about. I'm now going to discuss aspects of this, or the opposite of this, if you like, by talking about politics and the politics of the climate emergency. So political debate doesn't normally include a containing facility. Political debate, I don't know exactly how we define political debate, but it's certainly not a containing debate. It's a debate where people have arguments and conflicts about certain issues in order to reach conclusions which are turned into laws. That's what more or less political debate is about. It's not often that you get the impression in a political debate that things are being listened to respectfully, with empathy, with trust, with love. Instead, the overwhelming sense of a political debate is one of conflict. And it was, Eric, from as long ago in 1955, who equated the idea of an ideology such as capitalism being equated with a society that was not really healthy, not mentally healthy. So while climate psychology and the people who adopt that way of thinking is not overtly political, it's nevertheless implied in the theory, because it's difficult to ignore the role of a neoliberal system in both creating and perpetuating the climate emergency. Even before the climate emergency became widely known, Eric Fromm warned of the unhealthy psychological difficulties associated with the capitalist system. So in this book, The Sane Society, Fromm warns against the negative effects of unlimited consumerism. Although Fromm doesn't discuss climate change in 1955, it's clear that infinitely growing consumerism becomes unsustainable on a planet of limited resources. And so in order to continuously grow and not limit your consumption, it's a kind of madness to think that you can infinitely consume in a planet which is finite. So you're doing something infinite in the context of something finite. And that's a kind of madness. There's an unhealthy desire for consumables, and that leads to climate change. A reluctance to face the uncomfortable truths of climate change is linked to this desire for a comfortable, consumer-driven existence. So there is this idea that we don't want to think about, don't want to talk about climate change, because what climate change will do is make us uncomfortable, and it will take away the comforts that we associate with consumerism. So here are some of the unhealthy, the mentally unhealthy aspects of neoliberalism that enforce this view. First of all, the neoliberal perspective of the capitalism endorses is there is no real concept of the commons. Everything in the system that we live in the developed world, is about the individual who wins, the individual who loses, the individual who competes, the individual who consumes more, earns more money, therefore consumes more, and so on. Second, values based around the primacy of money-making or profit. This is the thing that we're focused on in the neoliberal society. And other values which are not economic values, such as values of quality, collaboration, participation, listening, all of those things as values, those things are secondary to the absolute value of money-making. 3, an ethic of work, capital gain, individuals as winners and heroic achievers. Those who don't succeed are losers, and they have nothing to say. So that's another aspect of the capitalist society, which really is not healthy. If you condemn someone to being a loser, you can't participate with them, for example, in a containing debate, because the loser has nothing to say. Survival of the fittest, taking precedence over care and compassion. So the system prefers to reward those people who are the strongest, the best, the fittest, the people who survive, and those people who don't survive, those people who are not strong enough to survive, they're not really offered the subsidiary or the secondary qualities of care and compassion. So 5th, there's an economic value attached to everything, including the self. You are what you're worth. You're not You don't have value in yourself. There's no intrinsic value. You are what you're worth. And that's why the CEOs of big corporations seem to earn incredible amounts of money. They are defined by the amount of money they earn, not by the quality of the people they are. And 6, the values that are important are those that can be counted. So if you can't count the value, so the quality of, for example, trust, the quality of trust can't be counted, and so we don't count it. It doesn't count. If it can't be counted, it doesn't count. So this really is an ideology. It presents itself as a rational economic plan, but actually it's an ideology before it's a rational economic plan, as demonstrated by the lack of attention given to the Stern Review on the economics of climate change, published in 2006. So this review concluded that significant rapid action on climate change in economic terms, so apparently in the terms appropriate for the ideology, in economic terms would cost far less than the cost of not acting now. So it will cost money to act now, but it's cheaper to act now than acting later. So this is what the conclusion of this particular report came to, but it hasn't been taken on board. We do not spend more money, we do not invest in reducing climate change now. In fact, quite the opposite. And the reason that the opposite happens is because actually people are not interested in the mid-term, long-term economic situation. They're only interested in the individual winning and losing of the present. And that is an ideological, not a rational, an ideological position. So what is possible? Sometimes it's difficult to know what's possible, and sometimes people say to me things like this: it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. Nevertheless, we can't allow ourselves to resign ourselves to the situation. We have to try and understand what might be possible even in this difficult situation. So in order to understand what's possible, we really must try to understand how we might equate, or to what extent we might equate, negative psychological states with those states that define neoliberalism, the ideology of neoliberalism. So I'm going to list some of these and compare the elements that can be identified as a neoliberal element and compare it to a psychological state. First of all, the omnipotence of the individual, or the omnipotence of entities. So this is a feeling, okay? This is a psychological state that anything is possible with hard work and perseverance. This is the mantra of the system that we live in, that an individual can do anything, and maybe even a nation can do anything. So remember, when we talk about bodies, we talk about the individual body, the meso body, the macro body. So this is true of the individual as a person, but it's also true of other bodies. With this comes a disregard for relationality and all else that gets in the way of the power that is in the individual. And if it's not in the individual, it'll be fought for and made into this power. Omnipotence includes having agency and power to rule over nature and to control any consequences. So the human being, the individual within a system and within the corporate body and within the national body. So you might think of the individual might be someone like Donald Trump. The corporation might be something like Microsoft. and the nation might be something like the United States. It could also be different individuals in different countries with different entities, okay? It just so happens that maybe the examples in the United States are clarifying for this. So those examples of omnipotence express themselves in ways which are not realistic, but they have the fantasy that they are omnipotent, to such an extent that if we have a problem with climate change, then we can deal with it. Why? Because we have the power, we have the knowledge, we are omnipotent, we can even control nature. And this is where ideas of carbon capture and so on come from. The idea that it doesn't matter what nature throws at us, we can take it because we're powerful. So there's a need to rethink our position in relation to others and our environment. There's a need to seek to work with and not against. Second, indestructibility, the idea that nothing can stop us. This is obviously related to omnipotence, a sense that the determined individual who is at war with anything that gets in the way is indestructible, can destroy all around if necessary for maintaining an individual indestructibility. It's a manifestation of the winner in the system. Care for others will be interpreted as a weakness, the weakness of the loser. So with omnipotence comes the idea that nothing can destroy us. And you can see this, for example, in the wars we have today. The Russian state, as personified by Putin, believes that they are indestructible. And so does the state of Israel. Indestructible, they can do anything. That's the sort of psyche that refuses to understand the reality of things and replaces reality with a fantasy of being indestructible, which of course is nothing to do with the realistic way of understanding the world. That we are not indestructible, we are very destructible. We are born, we grow old, we grow weak, and we die. We can have an accident. The nature of life is to be destroyed or to decline. And so the idea of indestructibility is a pure fantasy which is hyped up by the system. Similar to that in terms of the climate emergency is that it doesn't matter how many hurricanes there are, doesn't matter how many floods, we will not be destroyed. So what we need is vulnerability, care and compassion. We need vulnerability, care and compassion, the real aspects of living and life, to find a way into a discourse about what it is to be human in a fragile world. 3, overconfidence and artificial pride. So if a person is timid, or if an individual is lacking in confidence, this is perceived as another weakness in the neoliberal attitude. Therefore, even if the person is feeling vulnerable or fragile, this person will often display a confident facade, even in the face of doubt. The individual will be proud, even if there's very little to be proud about. This overconfidence and pride may well come across as arrogance and knowing everything. To succeed in the system, these qualities are often in the foreground. In terms of our relationship with nature, these people are certain that they can do what they want, and that nature has no rights and nature has no demands against this confidence that they have in themselves within that system. So, clearly, this overconfidence is based on fantasy. It's not realistic, it's a facade of fantasy. And so there's a need to generate a confidence within reality. For the absoluteness of the human individual. So if you remember at the beginning of the talk, we talked about the fragmented parts of the whole, and it's possible within the system that we live in to understand that the fragmented body of the individual, fragmented in the sense that it's taken apart from the entire living entity of the planet, this fragmented part, which we call the individual, is absolute in importance and value. So neoliberal elevates the human individual above everything. So, I mean, within that, the idea that nature has anything to do with us is completely irrelevant. But, you know, there are some examples recently of conferring rights to nature, and the idea of giving rights to nature is so far apart from the absolute individualism of the capitalist system that we're talking about things that are the furthest apart possible. It's interesting, nevertheless, that there is a little bit of progress in this area. So the example that we can choose, which
Espera aí, deixa eu colocar isso na sala de novo, vou colocar para televisão.
Eles estão atentos.
Então, eles não estão aqui enquanto eu tô vendo.
Chama José Maria.
Zé Maria? Eu nem conheço a pessoa mais que
Eu nunca consigo ver alguém.
A gente está online? Deixa eu olhar aqui.
Veja.
Não estamos. Não estamos online. Agora o slide está?
Oi, Zé Maria, você tá aí?
Estou aqui, Nélia. Tem que fazer. Caiu a transmissão aí.
Isso.
Ela tem que fazer o que ela fez aquela hora lá.
Aham.
Ok.
Acho que ela está fazendo já, então está dando tudo certo. A gente só queria saber se você estava aí. Obrigada, Zé Maria.
Ah,
This is about social agreement. Okay, great. Find interesting?
No.
It's basic way of coming.
Yeah. I think we need to continue talking. Certo? Professor Mary. I think it's Stop. Sorry.
Okay, so the fifth aspect of the neoliberal system, which we want to compare with psychology, an unhealthy way of being, is the feeling of exceptionalism as a reward for being a winner. And this leads to the feeling of entitlement, that I deserve things. So the successful individual in the system believes that they are exceptional. Donald Trump and many people. And that what might apply to others, the losers, does not apply to them. This is also true of groups and nation states. Because a person is exceptional, they are entitled to privileges that are denied others, including denied to nature. So this way of thinking leads to the conclusion that the climate emergency might be terrible for many people, but not for those who are success in life. In other words, those who have succeeded in the system or within the system. Exceptionalism can be replaced by embedding a reinvigorated sense of democracy, equality, and equity. And within the idea of democracy, equality, and equity, I think we can understand, following on from the idea that you might give rights to nature, that a democratic view of understanding the world is not just about equality and equity in human terms, but it's about the respect and equality and equity we might give to the people and the environment that are around us, the respect we might give to nature, the equal treatment we might give to the natural world, if we felt that the natural world was something close to us, instead of feeling that we're exceptional and different from nature. If instead of that we felt we were close and part of nature, then we would take more care of nature. And of course, that is the reality, because we do depend on nature. So it's realistic, it's not mad, it's realistic to assume that we must have a good relationship with nature, that respects nature. And it's mad, it's unhealthy to think that we are separate from nature. And yet, that's what the neoliberal system encourages us to do. It encourages us to think that we are separate. Okay, the next ideas, number 6 is facing reality and mourning our loss. So to face the reality of the climate emergency, including a responsibility that belongs to both individuals and nations, is a near impossible task in a neoliberal socio-economic system. The reality of climate change, the reality of how things are interconnected, the reality of how we are part of nature, not a part of nature, not separate from nature. This is a reality which is not recognized by many people in the system. So it is a form of unhealthy thinking. You might even say it's insane to imagine that we are separate from nature. And yet this is what happens within this kind of system. Because the system flourishes in a state of unreality, made real, in inverted commas, through fantasy. The system encourages the consumer to be in a constant search for an ideal state where, in the end, at last, the person, therefore society, will be happy. Happiness in this system is never achieved and always beckons from the horizon, leading to frustration and anger. So it doesn't matter how much you consume. The psychology is that you want to consume more. There's no end point of consumerism. And so you understand consumerism as a way of being happy, but because you can't reach the end, you're never happy. And if you're not happy, you feel frustrated and you feel angry. And then this anger and frustration can be projected into the outside world. Quotation here from Paul Hoggett in his book, Paradise Lost, connected to this. The belief that the longed-for object, the object of happiness through consumerism, has been taken or stolen or spoiled by another, substitutes for being able to acknowledge the loss of illusion and mourn its passing. So to understand that happiness is not connected to consumerism is to feel the possibility of feeling sorry for this reality, but at the same time facing the reality. And the same goes for understanding that we have to cope with climate change. It may be that coping with climate change might reduce, in some cases, our ability to consume. And that might be a reality that makes us sad. But through the sadness, through the mourning of the passing of our fantasy and the facing of reality, we're able to take action to remedy climate change. Okay, number 7 in this list, the problem of ownership. A neoliberal system converts all aspects of life into objects that can be bought by money and owned by individuals and corporations, and this includes anything. Anything is an object that can be bought, including nature. So happiness can be bought and nature can be owned. And of course, this is also a fantasy in the sense that you might consider nature to simply exist as part of your own body, in the sense that we are the body of nature, we are an aspect of the natural body that is the world. So to own nature would be like owning ourselves. It makes no sense. It's not a realistic idea that we can own everything and that we could put a price on everything. The coral reef off Australia, the barrier coral reef is being destroyed by climate change, by rising temperatures. What kind of value does that have in monetary terms? And if it has a value, how do you calculate it? And what other values connected to losing the coral around the world? It's so difficult when you think about it in realistic terms. It makes no sense. So the fantasy that we can put a price on everything is exactly that, a fantasy. It's not realistic. And so the neoliberal system works through fantasy, not through a realistic understanding of the world. And this fantasy is an illness, it's a mental illness. And it does remind me very much of Erich Fromm's sane or insane society. So these are psychological extremes that are symptoms of an unhealthy state of mind. And maybe this is the mind that is the root cause of the destruction of our natural habitat. There's an incompatibility between the system and the required outcome. It just doesn't work. You can't have the realistic green solution for our planet, which is ourselves. We are part of the planet. This can't exist in the system, the neoliberal system, which eats and exploits the planet, as this graphic demonstrates. It's an impossible equation. It can't work. It's a fantasy to imagine it can work, because it can't work. So, to conclude, as a summary, major conclusion: the socio-economic system encourages attitudes that are detrimental to mental health and therefore detrimental to dealing with climate change. You can't escape this conclusion. This is a conclusion that we have to face. It's a hard conclusion, because what we're saying is that the very structure of our socio-economic system is a fantasy. That structure of working and living is not real. And because it's not real, because it's a fantasy, it leads to the destruction of things that we hold dear, such as our natural environment. And there's no alternative to this, because from a psychological perspective, from a climate psychology perspective, we must understand reality. And the ideology of our system is not connected to reality. The ideology of our system is connected to fantasy. And so on this last slide, I just want to show once again how there are direct links between systemic issues and unhealthy psychological approaches and climate change. So we have on the left of the screen a list of so-called neoliberal ways of thinking, and on the right I have a sort of translation of what this might mean in terms of climate change and climate psychology. So the neoliberal tenets are omnipotence, indestructibility, overconfidence and pride, the absoluteness of individuality, exceptionalism and entitlement, an inability to face reality, the ownership of everything that can be counted and bought for money. And all of these things together, which are features of the neoliberal system, could be translated into this kind of thinking. Omnipotence is my defense mechanism. If I'm omnipotent, then I don't have to worry about climate change. I'm indestructible. This gives me confidence above all else, and I'm proud of my achievements. Thinking about climate change would harm my confidence. As a person, I am everything. All else, including nature, is secondary. My superiority means that I am different to all living things and therefore entitled to everything I want. This makes it difficult to accept any reality such as climate change. Instead, I will adopt the fantasy that science will save the Earth in the end, and anyway, I'll probably be dead. Since my life is based on ever-increasing consumerism, I want to buy everything, including the Earth. Reality, said Aldous Huxley, again like Eric Fromm, in distant past in history, reality cannot be ignored except at a price. And the longer ignorance is persisted in, the higher and more terrible becomes the price that must be paid. Whether it's an emotional price, a price of life, or even, as the Stern report described, an economic price. And you can see here, the reality is plain to see, and we see it every year, and every year it gets worse. That's the reality. And the fantasy is that it doesn't matter too much. It matters a bit, but not very much, not enough to take action. Okay. And the truth is that the Earth's average surface temperature in 2023, last year, was the warmest on record since record keeping began in 1880. You would imagine that the reality of that would make us act. The fact that it doesn't demonstrates that we live in a fantasy.
Gente, se alguém tiver alguma pergunta, pode mandar no chat que a gente faz para o Julian.
So, Julian, I am convinced about or disturbed about reality and fantasy. How you see in this moment the relation, the possibility of the politics to be a different way, able to lead us to the reality, or it's a question to another kind of institution or experience?
I'm not optimistic. Okay. However, it's necessary to keep focused on the reality and to participate with people, not just with politicians, because the politicians are connected to the corporations, and the corporations are connected to the money system, and the money system is the fantasy that keeps the system going, and that is not going to help us to face the reality. So we need to stay focused on reality, and through an increasing awareness of that reality among people, maybe that can influence the decision-making and the politicians. But it's a very difficult task, because the fantasy is sustained by the money system and by short-term profit and big profit. I mean, it's amazing what these people earn, you know. We're tiny, impoverished beings compared to the managers and directors and the CEOs of the corporations. The people who run the oil companies wear nothing. And so their reality is earning more money, and they think it's real because they can see the money. But of course, in the bigger picture, in the holistic picture, it's a fantasy. It's only real for them in the fragment of their money. So we have a difficulty in the way we perceive the way the world is in reality. breaking down fantasy is not necessarily an easy thing to do. And I've suggested that we need to have different methods of debating and thinking, even in the university, for example. In the university, we can imagine forums for democratic participation that give the students a voice instead of allowing all decision-making to be taken by the top, by the managers of the university. Maybe there's a way of incorporating the student voice into making decisions. And I think that participatory democracy, not in the university, but in other places, is very important. You know, the democracy we have today is not really a democracy, because you allow the leader who has been voted to take decisions, and of course they always do something different to what they say, and then you're stuck for 4 or 5 years. That's not really a democracy. A democracy is giving voice to people. And it's a realistic democracy, because it's false to imagine that voting someone in for 4 years is democratic, because it obviously is not democratic. You know, it's that we allow ourselves to have a fantasy of democracy. So if we change, it's all about being realistic. What is real democracy? Real democracy is when everyone feels they're empowered to have a voice, they have agency. False democracy is to imagine that if you vote once every 4 years, you're in a democratic system. You're not. And I think a democratic system is related to the containing system. Okay? Proper participation is contained discourse, contained discussion. So ideas of having a container for thought is also democratic. Okay? Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
No chat não temos mais perguntas, eu perguntei 2 vezes se alguém tinha uma pergunta.
Você tem pergunta?
Não.
Uma coisa que mexeu, isso fala para a gente poder traduzir?
Não, só absorvi bastante coisa e pensei bastante, tem páginas e páginas.
Então, Julian, thank you.
Thank you.
We can
Now I have a presentation in my class.
Agora?